turn to poetry, we are used to lovely subjects being discussed in the lines of poems, whether it's autumn leaves or beautiful flowers, or whether it's people falling in love with each other. We tend to assume that a poem will have an attractive topic. But that is not the case with all poetry. Robert Browning, in particular, liked to delve into the dark recesses of the human psyche in his poetry. He's particularly famed for his wonderful Home Thoughts from Abroad. "Oh, to be in England, now that April's there," is the poem's famous first line. But after that, Browning's poetry became much darker. And in his poem, Porphyria's Lover, he actually describes a murder. It's very hard to think of other poems that describe a murder, particularly from the point of view of the murderer. The poem was originally published as just Porphyria in the Monthly Repository in January 1836, and Browning then included it in his volume Dramatic Lyrics in 1842. This is the poem. Porphyria's Lover. The rain set early into night. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite, and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break, when glided in Porphyria. Straight she shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up, and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat, and let the damp hair fall. And, last, she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm about her waist, and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping made my cheek lie there, and spread o'er all her yellow hair, murmuring how she loved me, she, too weak for all her heart's endeavour to set its struggling passion free from pride, and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me for ever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain. Be sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew, while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around, and strangled her. No pain felt she. I am quite sure she felt no pain. As a shut bud that holds a bee, I warily oped her lids. Again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still. The smiling, rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love! She guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard. And thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. It is a really chilling and in many ways very disturbing poem. So it begins with the classic romantic idea of a dark and stormy night, a lover coming to meet the man she adores through the storm. There's clearly some sort of family disapproval in the background. She stirs up the fire, she sits down next to the man she adores with her bare shoulder, and she unlooses her hair, which has got damp from her walk through the rain. The stormy night, I think, reflects the inner turmoil of the murdering narrator as he waits impatiently for his mistress. But she comes in and the fire blazes up, the cold is shut out, and everything seems warm, cosy, and wonderful for the lovers. Porphyria's name is an interesting one. It reminds us of the disease, a disease that King George III evidently suffered from and which caused his madness. The disease had been classified and named just a few years before Robert Browning wrote this poem. So that sense of madness, of death, of disease is there in the very name of the heroine of the poem. Now Porphyria looks up at the murderer adoringly, and he suspects that eventually he will lose her. So this moment is sort of the climax of his hold over her. He wants to keep it forever, and he repeats the word, "She was mine, mine." Now, in Robert Browning, there are often erotic suggestions in his very violent poems, and I think that this is certainly the case in this one. The bare shoulder, the unloosening of the hair, loose hair being very much a sexual symbol in the Victorian era. And clearly he is pathologically jealous, so he wants to keep her at that one moment in life, and we get the almost simplistic reasoning of the insane in the wording with which he describes the murder of Porphyria. He writes, "I found a thing to do," and that moment is a very chilling line in the poem. He then winds her hair around her throat and he strangles her, and then he arranges her. Now, in the Victorian era, people often used art to recreate paintings, a sort of tableau vivant. People would get into the position of the characters in a painting. And here I think the man and his mistress Porphyria are sort of part of a process of artistic creation as he places her head and makes sure that she is artistically sitting there next to him. Now he knows she will never leave. But every so often he rearranges that hair, tightens it to bring colour into her cheeks. And he comments that she wanted to give herself to him, and ironically, of course, she has now done so for life. The poem ends with a very fascinating 2 lines. "And all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word." Now, Robert Browning, as poet, is giving us no moral commentary in this poem, and it's even there in the final line. Is the murderer seeking some sort of divine condonement of what he has done? Does he believe that God is satisfied with what he has done? Is he schizophrenic and listening to voices in his head, and he feels that somehow God should be responding to his action? We don't know if he's uneasy at God's silence, or is he feeling justified and exultant that God has stayed out of it altogether. We sense at the end that his eyes are almost glittering with triumph because God's thunderbolts have not fallen. Or perhaps it is saying there is no God to make any comment anyway, and had there been a God, perhaps he might have prevented this awful murder from taking place. I find Porphyria's Lover a very intriguing poem, even though a disturbing one. I think Browning has written it incredibly cleverly. It is gruesome, but it is a poem that delves into very dark psychological places. And I think that Browning, who would go on to write many other disturbing poems, and who's famed for writing The Pied Piper of Hamelin about the deaths or disappearance of all of those children, he was a poet who loved those darker places of the human psyche. I think Porphyria's Lover is a very fine work indeed, and highly unusual in being a poem written by a murderer describing his murder.